Howdy, it's Kyle talking about Morocco. Recently, my wife and I had an opportunity to visit the country and we loved it. So much so that while we were there, we determined, yeah, we're going to come back again. And this video is going to be an overview of the country. There's all kinds of good info on things to do and sights to see. And this isn't going to be a travel video like that, just more of an overview of the geography of the country to learn a little bit more about it. So if you're interested in the country and not quite sure if it's a place you want to visit, this might be a good video for you. And if you know you are going to visit Morocco, this might also be a good one for you as well to determine what parts of the country you may or may not want to see. But either way, let's talk about Morocco. Morocco is the northwesternmost African country bordering both the Atlantic Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea. The population of the country is approximately 38 million people. That ranks it 39th in the world. It's about the same population as Canada. In order to talk about the area of the country, I have to mention Western Sahara. So when you see a map of Morocco, it will often look just like this, just the main part of the country that we usually refer to as Morocco, but sometimes it will look like this, showing a large area, and more often than not, it will look like this, showing this large area with a dashed line going across it. And this dashed line separates what is Morocco from Western Sahara. This is a disputed area that is technically part of Morocco, and I'm not going to get into the geopolitics of it, but just know if you were to visit there, you wouldn't have to use a passport. But if you count just the undisputed portion of Morocco, it's the 57th largest country in the world. The name Morocco is derived from the name of the city, Marrakesh. So for many centuries, the entire kingdom of Morocco was simply referred to as Marrakesh, one of the cities, and through the years, that word kind of changed with Portuguese and Spanish and Italian influence into Morocco. It's also worth noting when you look at a map, you might see these two little spots here that aren't part of Morocco that look like they might be. These are Ceuta and Melilla. These are Spanish exclaves surrounded by Morocco. I'm not going to go into detail with these, but there's a really good video by World Geography channel Canubis talking about these two exclaves in Morocco. Demographically, the country is very multicultural with largely Arab and Berber influences, but also sub-Saharan Africa and European influences. Berbers, or the Amazigh, are the main indigenous group of the region, and through the centuries, many people, including Arabs, Africans, and Europeans, came into the region and mixed together. It is an officially Muslim country. Approximately 99% of the population identifies as Muslims. When you visit, you'll see there are no strict dress codes in the country, although most people do dress conservatively. We didn't see a single local man or woman wearing either shorts or a tank top, and the only people we saw wearing shorts and tank tops were tourists. The vast majority of the women wear head coverings, but not that many in the cities wear full burqa. But in the cities, you will also see some local women wearing fashionable European or American clothes, including maybe tight jeans. So the impression that I got is that it's a conservative Muslim country, but not super strict. And with it being so multi-ethnic, it's also multilingual. The official languages are Arabic and Berber, and French is also taught as a required second or third language in public schools. It's worth noting that the dialect of Arabic spoken in Morocco is quite different than the one spoken in other parts of the Arab world. From what I understand, if you speak standard Arabic, you'll be able to understand the Moroccan dialect, but a lot of it might sound a little strange. And also about 1/3 of the population speaks French. And along the Mediterranean coast, many of the people speak Spanish. In the biggest cities and tourist centers, you'll find a handful of people speaking English, but just know if you're in Morocco speaking English to people, that's their third, fourth, or maybe even fifth language. One of the first things you might think of when you think of Morocco is its history. I'm not going to get too much into the history, but the area was first settled by the Berber or Amazigh. And in the years 700 to 1000, you had many people migrate from the Arab world, bringing Islam with them. And then right around the year 1000, there was a lot of contact with some of the Europeans and other groups from outside the region. And of course, there were plenty of wars and people fighting over some of this land. And if you're in the most historic parts of the cities, most of the stuff you're seeing is built in the 16th and 17th centuries. And when you talk about the old cities of Morocco and the Arab world in general, you might hear words like Medina, Souk, and Kasbah. The Medina is just the old part of town. It's the generic name for the old district. So if you're in those narrow alleys going through the marketplaces, that's the old Medina, the old walled city. A souk is just the marketplace itself, so most of the old souks are located within the Medina. And because of that, the two terms are often interchanged, but the souk is the marketplace and the Medina is the old town itself. And a Kasbah is the garrison or the fortress. And the Kasbah is also located inside or directly adjacent to the Medina, so as a result, the term Kasbah and Medina are often interchanged. And most of the medinas and the souks and the old towns in the Moroccan cities were built in the 16th and 17th centuries. So you have these medinas and kasbahs, and they're being fought over by the Portuguese, Spanish, French, and English. It changed hands a bunch of times, and by the early 20th century, it was divided up mainly between France and Spain. France colonized most of central Morocco, and Spain colonized the Mediterranean coast and the south end. And in 1956, Morocco gained independence, so the Kingdom of Morocco was united with the former French colony areas and the former Spanish colony areas. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the economy of the country. The total GDP is about $360 billion, which ranks it 60th in the world. And its GDP per capita is around $10,000 American, which ranks it 122nd in the world. What leads to the GDP of the country is a relatively diversified economy. Phosphate mining is huge. It's the number 2 producer of phosphates in the world. There's a good amount of manufacturing and factories there, with Renault, Nissan, and Fiat all having plants there. The Tangier Mediterranean port is the largest port in Africa, and it's also the largest port on the Mediterranean Sea. You'll see oranges and other citrus, olives, grapes, figs, and dates. And tourism is also huge in the country as well, especially in the most historic cities and along the beaches. So now I want to talk a little bit about the physical geography of Morocco. There are 4 major physical regions in the country: the Atlantic coast, the Mediterranean coast, the mountainous interior, and the Sahara. The main mountain range you'll find in the country are the Atlas Mountains. The Atlas themselves are divided up into 3 individual ranges and a separate mountain range that is oriented east-west called the Rif. And these are some pretty tall mountains. The highest peak in the country is called Toubkal. It stands at 4,167 meters and is also the highest peak in the entire Atlas range. And most of the historic cities in the country are founded on the west or windward side of the Atlas Mountains. So whether it's Marrakesh, Fez, or Meknes, these are all on the western slope of the mountains, whereas the eastern side is the rain shadow side or the leeward side, and this is where you have high desert, the Sahara. The country as a whole is very similar to California and Arizona in terms of its climate. The Mediterranean coastal areas have that beautiful California coastal climate where it's basically always nice. But just like the southwestern US, once you get away from the coast, it gets much drier, much hotter, and turns to desert. So by the time you get to interior Morocco, including those most historic cities, the climate is much more like Arizona with really hot summers. You look on a map where the northern tip of Morocco gets kind of close to the southern tip of Spain, that's the Strait of Gibraltar. Think about how much transport and trade has gone through the Strait of Gibraltar through the centuries. Enough to where the UK has an exclave there, Spain has an exclave there, and Tangier was once an international zone. Okay, so now I want to talk about some of the major cities of Morocco. The capital is Rabat. The population is about 600,000 people with over 1 million people in the metro area. It's one of the 4 imperial cities of the Old Kingdom of Morocco, with the other 3 being Fez, Marrakesh, and Meknes. The city was founded in the 1200s, and most of what you see in terms of the old Medina and the walls were from the 17th century. And with it being the capital, it's where you have the center of government. It's also where you have all the foreign embassies, and because it isn't quite as industrial and touristy, it's also less chaotic. It seems a little more orderly. The Medina is on a grid, so it isn't the crazy maze that some of the other old cities have. So if you want to see some legit old Morocco without the huge crowds of tourists, check out the capital, Rabat. The largest city in the country is Casablanca. It sits on the Atlantic coast and has a population of about 3.4 million people. Casablanca is Spanish for White House, but the town was actually named White House before the Spanish arrived. And this city is the economic and corporate engine of the country. International companies that have a presence in Morocco are mainly in Casablanca. With it being home to many domestic and international banks, Casablanca is the main financial center in all of Africa. It has a huge seaport, is the major airline hub, and is also the hub for the high-speed trains. But historically, the city was nowhere near as important as some of the other historic cities in Morocco. In 1900, the population was only about 10,000 people. So it's had a similar population trajectory as the US cities Las Vegas or Miami, going from basically nothing in 1900 to millions today. But with it being such a corporate and finance and industrial center, it's not a main place for tourists to go to. Although if you fly into the country or you're riding the high-speed train, you might very well go through Casablanca. The second largest city in the country is Fez. It has about 1.2 million people and was founded in 789. It's inland, it's in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains, and as a result, it's historically been a huge city in terms of livestock, crops, and grains. Tourism is huge in the city for people wanting to see some of the historic sites, but also because it has many Islamic shrines. It's more chaotic and less touristy than Marrakesh, but there are still plenty of tourists there. And speaking of Marrakesh, it's the third largest city in the country with about 1 million people. And it was founded as an oasis along a river valley in the foothills of the Atlas Mountains. It was founded in 1070, but most of the old city around the Medina was built in the 16th and 17th centuries. Marrakesh is the #1 tourist city in the country, and it is pretty busy with tourists. And there are a lot of gorgeous sites in the city. You can just walk around the Medina all day getting lost. The main square, the Jamal Al-Fina Square, I'm not sure if that's how it's pronounced, is just a really exciting place to hang out at night. You'll see all kinds of street performers, dancers, vendors of all types, people selling all kinds of food. From about sunset to about 10 p.m. or so, it's going to be a lot of tourists, but after 10 p.m., once the tourists go away, it's just locals and it goes on all night. We visited Marrakesh and not Fez, so I can only speak to the Medina and Marrakesh. But what it is just a huge maze, a giant labyrinth of paths that go all around in all different directions. And you'll have a wonderful time just walking around the Medina, getting lost, checking out some of these shops and little food stalls. And for me, the highlight of the trip was just walking around the Marrakesh Medina, getting lost. And the fourth of the old imperial cities of Morocco is Meknes. Has a population of about 650,000 people and is only 60 kilometers west of Fez. The city was founded in the 11th century, the first mosque in the 12th century, and with it being the smallest of the 4 imperial cities, it's also the least visited. It's just as old and beautiful as the other Medinas, but it doesn't have the same concessions to tourism as the other big cities. Heading up to the Mediterranean is the city of Tangier with about 1 million people. The city was founded around the year 1000, and being right there on the coast has been fought over through many, many centuries. While France and Spain colonized the country, the area around Tangier was known as an international zone. But with fewer rules and regulations, it also became seedier. A lot of drugs, a lot of prostitution, and when the city became part of Morocco, when Morocco became independent in 1956, it was kind of an embarrassment to the country. But in the past 10 years or so, the king has really put a lot of emphasis on Tangier. And when we were there, it really felt like there was some Moroccan gentrification going on. The Medina in Tangier is just as old as the ones in Marrakesh and Fez, but it isn't anywhere near as large. So you can walk around, you'll get turned around a little bit, but it isn't so large you'll get totally lost. But with it being right there on the sea, you also have a really nice beach. And when you get to the area with the main beach, it's the new city, so you're outside of the walled Medina. A lot of modern hotels and restaurants, a lot of nightclubs. So it's a very interesting juxtaposition to be in this old walled city, walk maybe a quarter mile, and it's all modern, high-rises, and a big beach. Also in the Mediterranean region is the city of Tetouan. The population is about 400,000 people, and this is fairly close to Gibraltar. It was founded in the 13th century, and in the 20th century it was part of the Spanish colony. The buildings are similar architecture and that bright white color, just like you see in Tangier. And with Tetouan, you have the sea right there, then the city, then the mountains. So you have all this gorgeous scenery, old historic city, and it's not very touristy at all. Near the Mediterranean coast, near the Algerian border in the northeastern part of the country, is the city of Oujda. There are about 600,000 people here, and it's the most remote of the big cities in the country. Being this far east, it's much drier and more desert-like than some of the western parts of the country. And even though it's an old city near the coast, it's also by far the least touristed of the big cities in the country. And the last city that I'm going to mention is the coastal town of Agadir. This is right along the Atlantic, has a population of about 500,000, and this is the city in the country with the largest percentage of the population being of Berber descent. And this is another really old city with many buildings from the 16th century. However, most of the old buildings were destroyed in a 1960 earthquake. So if you were to visit Agadir now, there aren't a ton of really old buildings, and a lot of it's kind of ruins. But with it being right there on the beach, pretty low latitude, it's a very popular beach resort spot for Europeans. Okay, so those are the main cities that I wanted to discuss in the video. Now I'm going to go over some tips for travelers. You could rent a car and drive around. The roads are really good. But for us, and probably for most other people visiting the country, getting around by train is the preferred method. So Morocco has a really good train service. They have regular type trains that connect all the main cities. But they also have a relatively new high-speed train. And this high-speed train makes visiting the country really easy. You can get from one city to another very quickly. You can visit different parts of the country very easily. It's really easy to use, and for Western tourists, it's also really cheap. The high-speed portion of the train connects Casablanca to Tangier. We started off our trip in Marrakesh and then took the train to Casablanca, then the high-speed train from Casablanca to Tangier. And for us, that was the best way to visit the country, seeing two very different cities, Marrakesh in the middle near the mountains and Tangier right there on the coast. One thing you may also want to do when you're there is take a side trip up into the Atlas Mountains. This is the town of Oujda, I think it's how it's pronounced. It's about an hour from Marrakesh and a pretty cool spot. A bunch of restaurants lining the river, and many of the restaurants had tables that were in a little bit of water, so you could be sitting there with your feet in this really cold snow melt water. And that probably feels pretty good on those 100-degree summer days. And if you're into hiking, there are plenty of opportunities to go hiking or even multi-day backpacking in the Atlas. And if you're interested in doing more things in the mountains, Marrakesh is probably going to be your best base of operations. As I mentioned earlier, most people speak Arabic, one of the Berber dialects, and French. If you're in Marrakesh or some of the main touristy areas, you might be surprised how many people speak English, but you might also be surprised at how few people speak English in the airports and train stations. So at the airport, train station, and also arranging for a taxi, I was having to speak French to do it. You shouldn't have any issues finding an English-speaking tour guide or taxi driver, but just do know that English is going to be the third, fourth, or maybe even fifth language to people that speak it there. I'm not going to get into the food and drink of Morocco, but I do think worth mentioning is the orange juice. All throughout the country was hands down the best orange juice I've ever had in my life. The stuff coming out of Florida and California is straight up swill compared to the orange juice in Morocco. And in fact, the word tangerine, which is a type of mandarin orange, the word is derived from Tangier. So that's the general info I wanted to talk about with Morocco, the cities, and some travel tips. There are all kinds of videos and other resources that are great for individual sites and things to do and the foods of Morocco. But overall, Morocco is a beautiful country. We had a wonderful time and we already have plans to go back next year. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give me a thumbs up to let me know you approve, and subscribe to this channel if you're interested in learning more about geography from a nerdy perspective. But yeah, thanks for watching. Geography King, signing out. I'd like to give a special thanks to my superior patrons for their support, especially Adam V-Dubs. Apparently Adam has a pretty cool wife to celebrate August 19th with. Or maybe it's a nefarious plan, but either way, if you want to purchase a pin for the viewer wall map or just to support the channel, please check out my Patreon page with the link in the description. And as always, thank you very much.